Hey guys, tonight we're skipping the castles and coronations and heading straight for the romantic epicenter of the 13th century, a muddy village path ankle-deep in yesterday's regrets and goose droppings. The air hums with the scent of hay-damp wool and whatever your neighbour is trying to pass off as soup. You're standing beside a stone well cracked mossy, and probably the site of at least one minor haunting, because in the medieval world, this is where love begins. Your hands are raw from scrubbing things that probably shouldn't be scrubbed. Your tunic is aggressively itchy, and out of the morning mist comes a figure, clutching a basket of onions and the vague promise of shared property. They nod, you nod, and that's it. That's courtship. No sonnets, no serenades, just mutual silence and a hope they don't smell like cabbage. So before you settle in with your blanket and your bedtime beverage of choice, go ahead and click like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. No pressure, we're not the medieval church. Also drop a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is, because nothing brings the world together like insomnia and obscure historical courtship rituals. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's tiptoe into the hay-scented chaos of love 13th century style. It's early, chilly, somewhere in the countryside, maybe England, maybe France, maybe a mossy corner of Krakow. You've just been informed it's time to get married. You didn't propose, you didn't even flirt. Your uncle simply traded a pair of boots for a goat and casually included you in the deal. You blinked, the goat blinked, and now apparently you're engaged. Your first meeting might happen beside a well at the village bakehouse, or mid-goose wrangling at a saint's festival. Parents might be present, or they might be off betting on beetle races. Introductions aren't guaranteed. Sometimes you just spot someone over a steaming vat of communal laundry and think, yeah, they look like they'd survived childbirth. Historians still can't agree if medieval matchmaking was deeply communal or just one long cattle auction with better bread. Some records suggest peasants had a surprising amount of choice. Others imply it was mostly he owns half a pig and a cartwheel. She's got both ears. Let's make it happen. There are no rings, no love letters, no dramatic gestures. Instead, someone hands someone else a chicken, or a jug of ale, or whispers something promising in a barley field. If witnesses are present, and they almost always are nosy bunch, then congratulations, you might already be legally married and not even know it. If your betrothed shows up bearing a gift, it won't be a rose or a heartfelt poem. It'll be a hand-carved spoon, a slightly bent brooch, or if you're lucky, a coin with a hole poked through it. Romantic, sort of. Valuable. Not really. Counterfeit, possibly. But hey, it's the thought that counts. And through it all, you're being watched, not by your future in-laws, but by livestock. Chickens eye you with the judgment of seasoned matchmakers. Goats chew with barely concealed disappointment. Pigs grunt ominously. You try to make small talk, or not. In this world, silence isn't awkward. It's the default setting. Emotional intimacy comes after, if at all, usually once you've survived a famine, or at least a very long winter together. Still, there's hope. Maybe they have most of their teeth. Maybe they smell more like herbs than onions. Maybe they can recite a psalm without making eye contact with Satan. The bar is low, comfortably low. Later, you both attend Mass, not together, just near each other. Eye contact during the third psalm, practically scandalous. Walking them home afterward, even just to the edge of the pig pen. Brace yourself, rumours will fly faster than a tavern tab. On Saints' days, you might dance. You might accidentally spill cider on each other. You might discover if your potential spouse can lift a barrel or charm a goose. These are the true compatibility tests. And then come the superstitions. Games involving pebbles, moonlight, and possibly that one rooster who always looks like he knows your secrets. In some villages, matchmaking is less science and more interpretive poultry. Eventually the meeting ends. No kiss, no poetry, just a brief muddy farewell, and maybe a wink if you're feeling bold. But something has shifted. Your name has been spoken alongside theirs one too many times to ignore. Back home, your mother hums suspiciously cheerful tunes. Your father sharpens a hoe like he's preparing for war or farming. Could be either. In the medieval world, that's basically a blessing. So you lie down on your straw mattress, listen to the wind rattle the walls, and stare at the ceiling, wondering what just happened. Somewhere in the dark, a goat coughs. Somewhere else, an owl judges you from a beam. And yet, despite the confusion, the cold, and the complete lack of roses, you don't feel so bad. In a world where life is short, love is optional, and mud is eternal, this might just work. So, you've nodded your way into something resembling marriage, or at the very least a mutual agreement, vaguely witnessed by 3 neighbours and a goat. Now comes the real challenge. Not, are we in love, but can we get this done without angering the saints, conflicting with sheep shearing season, or overlapping with the full moon, when old Gertrude does her weather dancing? You might think weekends would be ideal for tying the knot. Absolutely not. In fact, the medieval calendar is a terrifying puzzle of holy days, harvest schedules, questionable omens, and Mildred from the dairy's niece's birthday. Finding a date that doesn't offend God, Wheat, or Walter the gossip is a small miracle. Let's begin with the church. Ah yes, the church, that noble institution that had firm opinions on everything from how long you should fast to how many doves were too many. For a wedding centerpiece spoiler, any number was too many. Weddings were banned during Lent Advent and basically every important saint's day, which meant give or take half the year was a no-go. And if your local priest was in a mood, he might ban April too. Just because. Historians still debate whether these rules were rigid or more like gentle suggestions with a side of eternal damnation. In some places, a well-timed chicken bribe could bend the rules. In others, you'd be fined, shamed, and forced to redo the ceremony sober. A true medieval punishment. Next comes farming season. If you live in a village, and let's be honest, you do, wedding dates are squeezed between stabbing seeds into dirt and stabbing wheat out of it. No one's stopping to bless your union when there's barley to thresh. That leaves you, guessed it, winter. Specifically, the magical window of January through early March, when the mud is extra deep and everyone's mildly frostbitten. Medieval romance folks, chilblains and cold stew. Now sprinkle in some astrology. If your village has a monk who moonlights as a stargazer, or that one guy who milks goats and claims to read omens in puddles, you'll hear about which days are unlucky. Mercury in retrograde means you'll argue. Venus and Mars too close, you'll argue passionately. Jupiter rising, extra thumbs for the babies. Astrology wasn't science, but it was loud. So you wait. Friday is lucky, Wednesday is safe, Saturday unlucky in most places, unless you're Scottish, in which case bring on the bagpipes and let's party like it's 12.99. When you finally find a date that pleases God Goat's grain and the guy who does the bell ringing, you still aren't done. Enter the banns. Post 12:15, your impending marriage has to be announced in church for 3 straight Sundays, like a medieval version of posting in a relationship and praying your ex doesn't comment. If someone objects, oh, and someone will things get interesting. Maybe a neighbour insists you're already married in the next village over. Maybe your ex shows up waving a cracked spoon you once gave her in love. Or maybe your cousin shouts, but they're second cousins, while pointing at a family tree carved on a shovel. Objections delay everything. Stir gossip and guarantee you'll be village famous until you die or move to the next hamlet. And you can forget about privacy. In small towns, news travels via breadlines, ale mugs, and that one man who sings every scandal as a ballad at the tavern. Oh, they kissed behind the ox shed. La la la. Thanks, Harold. Finally, the big day, or at least the mostly acceptable day. You didn't pick it for magic or passion, you picked it because it wasn't Lent. The sheep weren't giving birth and the priest wasn't out of town, attending his cousin's exorcism. And in some parts of Germany, couples went a step further, checking to see which ghost was haunting the churchyard, less aggressively on any given Tuesday. You really don't want to say your vows with a wailing monk hovering over the altar. It ruins the ambience. So when your moment finally arrives, it's less like a fairy tale and more like a well-negotiated truce. You've outmaneuvered clergy crops and cosmic forces. You still don't know if you love this person, but the omens haven't cursed you, and the priest hasn't fainted, so you press on. You stand in your drafty cottage, warming your hands by the hearth, mentally checking off your list, not Lent check. No sheep emergencies check. Bans declared, and no dramatic objections involving spoons or ghost check. The rooster crows, the sky shifts from dark grey to might snow later. You take a breath and step outside into the slush, ready for the next chapter. Paperwork, vows, and Latin, no one, including the priest, is totally sure how to pronounce. You step outside, breath misting in the cold, your best tunic brushing stiffly against your knees. Today is official, documented, witnessed, and ideally legible. The air smells of firewood and boiled cabbage, which is just about as festive as it gets. You're heading to this church, but this isn't the grand stained glass cathedral from movies. No, this is a modest building of stone and creaky beams slightly leaning to the left, with a door that sticks unless you shove it twice and mutter. A place that smells of old incense, wet wool, and something faintly mildewish. Inside, a priest, or at least someone who has memorized enough Latin to pass as one is waiting with the holy book, a small ink pot and a sheet of parchment that's probably been reused from a failed oat inventory. You stand beside your betrothed, both of you clutching your sleeves and trying not to sneeze. The priest begins the paperwork, or more accurately, the pre-paperwork, because actual paper is a luxury. Most documentation is done on parchment animal skin, stretched and scraped until it's smooth enough for ink. It crinkles when rolled and smells faintly like goat, which is only fair since that's what it probably is. Now the scribe or priest, doubling as one, asks your names, and your father's names, and your place of residence, and what year it is, which, depending on your region, might be counted from Christ's birth, the reign of the local lord, or how many years it's been since the last big flood. Accuracy is approximate. He dips his quill slowly. The ink is homemade, usually from oak galls and iron salts. It stains fingers for days and smells like rusted vinegar. The writing is slow and squiggly. Latin fills the page, most of it formulaic, but with key blanks for your names, your families, and the crucial line consent is given by both parties, freely and without coercion. Historians still argue whether that line was always true. In many cases it wasn't. Social pressure, parental bargaining, and plain old survival often overruled romance. But on parchment, it's written clear as day, consentus mutuus. Just don't ask either of you to define that. There's no signature in the modern sense. Literacy is rare. If you're especially educated, you might make a shaky X beside your name. More often, someone witnesses on your behalf, a local merchant, your aunt with good memory, or a friend who once saw a donkey trial and never stopped talking about it. You're expected to recite a few words. Not vows necessarily, but something binding like I pledge myself to thee, or with this hand I bind thee. Holding hands during this part is legally significant. The joining of right hands is seen as consent and intent. If anyone saw you doing this in the tavern last week, well, that might already count. One mainstream fact that surprises modern minds: in many medieval contexts, a couple could be considered legally married after simply stating mutual intent before witnesses, even outside of church. The church preferred to sanctify it, sure, but the law was more interested in the moment of consent. The ceremony just made it prettier, or at least more public. You may be asked to provide a token, a coin, a small piece of land, even a belt, something of value, not because your spouse needs it, but because society needs to see that you're offering something. It's symbolic. Here, have this worn-out buckle. Now we're forever. Romance. Another quirky tradition. In some places, your names were added to a ledger, kept under the altar stone. Not just as a record, but so the union would be blessed by proximity to saints' relics. One bishop allegedly wrote names on dried fish skin. It disintegrated in rain, but was considered extremely pious while it lasted. After the paperwork, such as it is, comes the blessing. The priest recites Latin phrases you can't understand, possibly mispronouncing half of them. There's holy water. Maybe a bell rings. Maybe the goat outside starts bleating at the exact moment the words joined, before God has spoken, which everyone takes as a good sign. You're not quite sure if you're married yet, but people are nodding. The priest has folded the parchment. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Well done." There's the sense that something has shifted, not in your heart perhaps, but in the eyes of the law, the village, and that goose someone's still holding in the corner. And oh yes, the witnesses. You need a few. They are not silent observers either. They will remember this day with stunning clarity when gossiping 5 years from now. I was there, they'll say. He almost sneezed during the blessing. Your legacy is being built one awkward moment at a time. As the parchment dries and your palms finally separate, you feel a kind of weight settle in. Not heavy, not scary, just solid, like something's been locked into place. There's no music, no petals, but the room is warmer now. The priest smiles with the corners of his eyes. Your spouse gives a small shrug that says, "Well, that's done." And somewhere in the room, the smell of wine starts to drift in. Because where there is parchment, there must also be a toast. You're officially, legally, and possibly spiritually bound. Time to celebrate, assuming the goose doesn't object. You're officially wed, or at least as wed, as two people can be, with dried ink, half-remembered Latin, and a goat eyeing the ceremonial tablecloth. Now it's time for the blessing. But don't picture rose petals and organ music. Think barley wine incense smoke and the faint creak of a wooden crucifix swaying in the draught. If your village has a priest, he stands front and centre, adjusting his robes which smell of candle wax and something vaguely like onions. If you don't have a priest or he's out with dysentery again, the ceremony might be overseen by a local elder or tavern keeper who owns the only table long enough to seat 12. Either way, the marriage is going ahead. Now, blessings in the medieval world aren't just nice to have, they're needed. Marriage is a sacrament, and sacraments require supervision, especially when they involve lifelong promises and possible child-producing activities. The church wants a say. God presumably wants a say. Your great-aunt Agnes definitely wants a say. You and your new spouse are standing awkwardly before whoever's officiating, surrounded by fidgeting family members and a couple of goats that wandered in because someone left the door open. The priest or substitute priest raises a hand and starts to chant. It's a long string of words about duty, loyalty, and avoiding the temptation of the flesh, unless it's for procreation. You're barely listening because your legs are starting to fall asleep, and your partner just whispered, "Is he blessing us or listing the names of Roman emperors?" A mainstream fact that surprises modern audiences, while the church eventually took full control of marriage early on, it was shockingly informal. As long as there was consent and some acknowledgement before witnesses, that could be enough. The church didn't even insist on being present until the 12th century. Before that, backyard ceremonies were a thing. Still, by your century, church involvement is expected. The blessing involves scripture, holy water, and occasionally the laying on of hands. You both bow your heads while the officiant mutters in Latin, possibly skipping a few words to save time. There's usually a psalm. There's always a prayer for fertility, which is whispered like a secret, and then repeated louder, just to make sure God hears. Then comes the barley wine, or mead, or whatever the local brewer has whipped up this week. A toast is essential. The drink is usually sweet, heavily spiced, and fermented to somewhere between mildly dizzy and accidentally prophetic. You and your spouse take a shared cup. The symbolism is obvious: one drink, one life. Also, the mug only has one handle. This is followed by the communal clapping. Not applause exactly, but a kind of ritual drumming on tabletops or stomping on floorboards. It scares the goats, and in theory, any lingering spirits who might want to meddle in your marriage. Noise is protective. The louder the better. At least one person will bang 2 spoons together with wild devotion. Historians still debate whether these noisy rituals were originally pagan or just practical. What's certain is that they endure long after anyone remembers why they were banging spoons in the first place. Next, you may be led to a makeshift altar, sometimes just a table with a cross, and presented with symbolic gifts. A loaf of bread to signify nourishment, salt for preservation, a piece of iron for strength, and yes, sometimes a small bag of herbs tied with twine for fragrance or fertility, depending on who hands it over and how much they wink. The officiant finally declares you married, or bonded, or something in Latin that could also mean free from taxes for a year, depending on pronunciation. Either way, people cheer. You may or may not kiss. Kissing isn't standard. Some priests discouraged it, others insisted on it, and some guests took bets on how long it would last. Then the tavern moment. Regardless of where the blessing happened, chapel or barn, the party always migrates to the local drinking spot. It's less about celebration, more about logistics. Taverns have benches, taverns have food, and taverns have ale, which is crucial for soothing nervous in-laws. Inside the tavern, the atmosphere changes. It's warmer, noisier, and somehow more relaxed. There's a fire crackling, someone's carving bread with a dagger, a pig's leg is turning on a spit. Your uncle is already on his second tankard and loudly insisting that he once danced with a duchess. A fringe tidbit, in some English villages, the tavern played such a central role in weddings that couples who couldn't afford a church blessing would simply declare themselves married in the pub, before witnesses over a shared pint. The phrase alehouse wedding was both affectionate and mildly scandalous. You sit beside your spouse and for the first time, maybe you look at them with something like comfort. Not passion, not yet, but comfort. Their sleeve is slightly singed from standing too close to the hearth. Their smile is crooked, and when they raise their mug to yours, it clinks just right. People begin to toast you, not just congratulations, but long poetic rambles about loyalty, fertility, livestock, and occasionally weather. Someone sings a song about love and leeks. Someone else recites a proverb about geese and patience. You nod politely through all of it, trying to keep track of which toasts are compliments and which are veiled warnings. And while the night is still young, the air thick with roast smoke and joy, you hear it the first honk. The goose is here. You don't know what it means yet, but rest assured it will absolutely make an appearance in this marriage. There it is again, that honk, somewhere between majestic and mildly annoyed. You glance toward the door, half expecting a procession, and sure enough, someone is carrying a goose. Yes, a real one. Feathers, feet, attitude and all. It flaps indignantly, as if offended to be part of your nuptials. But it is here, and it is important, because in many medieval communities, geese were part of the marriage process. Not just dinner though, sometimes they ended up that way, but symbols, omens, even part-time dowries. You probably weren't expecting to share your wedding day with poultry, but here we are. Let's start with the basics. The goose is a status bird. It's not as humble as a chicken, nor as grand as a swan, but somewhere firmly in the respectable middle. Owning a goose in some villages meant you had land because geese needed space. Giving a goose as a wedding gift. That was generous. Giving two, that was a scandalous flex. In certain regions of France and the Low Countries, a bride's family might present a goose to the groom as part of the bride ale, a sort of feast payment to thank the village for attending. In other places, the groom brought the goose, strutting it into the party as a symbol of fertility, prosperity, and look what I managed to catch. Historians still argue whether the goose was purely symbolic or more often ended up stuffed and roasted by nightfall. In some records it's described as honoured, in others delicious. Likely it depended on how well the wedding went. And there are stranger customs too. One tale from a Welsh village claims a goose was set loose in the hall, and whichever guest it ran toward would be the next to marry. In one Scottish version, it was blindfolded first, because why not add chaos to fate? There's also the tale of a goose that refused to honk during a ceremony, prompting a priest to delay the blessing until it did. God's silence, he declared, until the bird finally squawked indignantly during the groom's half-hearted vow. The marriage went ahead, the goose was canonized. Okay, not really, but it was spared. Let's not forget the practical side. A goose provided feathers for bedding down, for cloaks, eggs for breakfast, and the occasional wing slap if you got too close. As wedding gifts go, it was wildly useful. A sort of medieval multi-tool wrapped in fluff and aggression. And if you were especially fortunate, the goose might even be trained, yes, trained to walk beside you in a sort of rustic bridal procession. Imagine the moment your new spouse at your side, muddy path beneath your feet, and a goose waddling proudly behind, like it's in charge of the whole affair. Which honestly it might be. Now, not every village used geese. In parts of Italy, doves were more popular. In Slavic regions, you might get a loaf of salt bread instead. But the goose lingered in legend, sometimes as dinner, sometimes as decor, sometimes as a kind of wedding MC with wings. A mainstream fact worth noting, the medieval obsession with symbolism extended to animals in almost every aspect of life. Cats were mystery, dogs were loyalty, pigs were wealth, but geese, they hovered somewhere between domesticity and defiance. They looked like they belonged in the yard, but acted like they ruled the estate. This is probably why the goose earned its place beside the bridal couple. Unpredictable, loud, slightly dangerous if provoked. In other words, a perfect metaphor for matrimony. You eye the goose now tucked under someone's arm, its beady eyes scanning the room, like it's judging who overcooked the lentils. A cousin jokes that it's the true officiant. Someone else tries to tie a ribbon around its neck. It bites them. Everyone laughs. The tension of the day begins to soften. As ale flows and the bread is sliced, the goose struts a little, as if inspecting your guests. You and your spouse exchange a glance. It's not romantic exactly, but it's mutual. A sort of, well, this is our life now moment, blessed by poultry. And then someone lifts their mug and toasts to the couple, and the goose a cheer erupts. Even the old widower in the corner cracks a smile. The room feels full in the best way. Not crowded, but complete. The kind of noise that says, you belong here. By the end of the night, the goose might still be walking. It might be roasting. It might have wandered off into the dark to start a legend. Whatever its fate, it was here. And it mattered. You might not remember every name, every toast, every awkward hymn, but you'll remember the goose, its feet tapping across the floor, its honk echoing between your vows, and the way in that moment it seemed to bless your marriage better than any priest could. Because sometimes in the middle of tradition and chaos, it's the ridiculous details that make everything feel real, or if it more often ended up seasoned, stuffed and surrounded by turnips by the end of the night. Some records describe the wedding goose as honoured and even given a name. Others mention it being plump and expertly roasted. The truth has always probably flapped somewhere in between. Now let's turn our attention from feathers to fabric. You and your new spouse, still slightly tipsy from barley wine and goose-based symbolism, are expected to make an appearance in your finest wedding attire. And by finest, we mean least patched and least stained from root vegetables. What you wear on your wedding day says a lot about you. It says whether your family owns sheep. It says how many coins they're willing to part with for dye. It even says indirectly whether you have a second outfit. Spoiler alert, you probably don't. If you're a bride, your tunic might be white, though not because of purity. White wool just didn't take dye well, and it was easier to clean. Red is also popular, symbolizing vitality, blue for loyalty, green for fertility, black if the weather's terrible and you're out of options. As for the groom, your wedding shirt is likely linen, freshly scrubbed and stiff with starch or salt. You might wear a belt with metal buckles if you can borrow one. Your shoes are made of leather, softened from months of walking in mud. And your hair brushed once. Accessories matter too. A small brooch, a borrowed ribbon, maybe even a posy of herbs tucked into your belt. Rosemary is traditional. It keeps evil spirits away and makes you smell less like sheep. Win-win. Now for the cabbage. Yes, cabbage. In parts of Eastern Europe and some rural British villages, brides were tested, or rather blessed, with cabbage leaves. They might wear them tucked into their shoes, place them under their pillows, or be pelted with them, gently, as they walked to the altar. The idea cabbage promotes fertility. Or maybe warded off spirits, or maybe it was just what people had on hand that wasn't rocks. One recorded tradition involves boiling cabbage on the wedding morning, then placing a cooled leaf on the couple's foreheads as a sort of calming compress. Imagine standing in front of your entire village cabbage on your face, pretending this is perfectly normal. And in that moment, it is. Let's not forget the coins. Coins are crucial. Whether pinned to clothing, baked into bread, or tucked into shoes, they symbolize wealth, real or aspirational. Some couples exchange tokens. A small pouch of copper, a ring carved from wood. One particularly poetic groom in a Swiss village gave his bride a flattened spoon to show she'd never want for soup. She reportedly cried. Whether from joy or confusion remains unclear. And if you're from a wealthier family, say a merchant class rather than farming, you might have a cloak trimmed with fur-dyed gloves or shoes with actual buckles instead of string. These details are commented on at length, for years. One wrong colour choice, and the village balladeer will write a song. Historians still debate the exact meanings behind certain fabrics. Was silk always a status marker? Did certain colours imply scandal? Was that goose feather in your bride's hair intentional or just a barnyard mishap? Academic papers have been written. Opinions remain divided. But everyone agrees on this: weddings were as much about display as about union. You showed your worth through cloth colour, coin and confidence, even if your leggings itched and your garland kept slipping over your eyes. There's also the question of shoes. In some places, guests tossed old shoes at the couple for luck. In others, they tried to steal the bride's shoe, perhaps, to hold it hostage for a ransomed kiss. The logic is unclear, the chaos guaranteed. By midday, you're halfway between exhausted and elated. You've been stared at, blessed, honked at, and possibly pelted with cabbage. Your sleeves are slightly damp. Your new spouse has wine on their collar, and still you're smiling. Because for all its mud and awkwardness, this wedding, your wedding, feels like something real. A ritual stitched together with tradition fabric and the occasional poultry-related surprise. And when you finally sit down on the carved bench reserved for the newlyweds, you do so with a sense of calm. You survived the cabbage, the goose, the spoon songs. The feast begins the way all great medieval events begin, with bread. A lot of bread, hard, dark round loaves that could double as roof tiles if the weather got rough. Someone slices them with a knife that's also been used to sharpen quills, gut fish, and possibly defend the goose. It's rustic, it's communal, it's delicious in that chewy, slightly burnt way that says, this took 12 hours to rise and still didn't quite. You and your spouse are seated at the head of a long wooden table or plank on barrels or hay bales, arranged in something vaguely rectangular. It depends on the village. Your seats are not thrones, they're barely chairs. One creaks every time you shift, but the placement is symbolic, front and centre, slightly elevated, so everyone can stare while you pretend to chew daintily. The order of seating matters. Your parents sit closest, nodding sagely, like they invented marriage. Elders next, the loudest relatives after that, then the baker who always brings extra, and someone who just showed up and no one has the heart to ask to leave. Possibly a monk, possibly not. The bride, you notice, is not eating much. This is expected. Brides aren't supposed to gorge. It's unseemly. Also, it's difficult to eat politely with 20 people watching and a sprig of rosemary tied to your wrist. Brides pick, brides sip, brides smile and pass the gravy. The groom, however, is allowed to eat. A lot. People count how many pieces of meat he takes. The theory is hearty appetite equals virility. And also, maybe he missed breakfast. Someone slides you a bowl of stew, so thick it stands on its own. You nod in gratitude. Your spouse nudges a parsnip toward you in a gesture that might be affection. Roast meats arrive next. Pork if you're lucky, venison if your cousin has illegal hunting connections, and fish if you're near the coast or not lucky at all. And yes, the goose might appear, basted golden, surrounded by apples. You try not to make eye contact. The food keeps coming. Onions baked in honey, pies that may or may not contain what the label claims. Something green that smells like hope and regret, and trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. By the end of the meal, the trencher is as soaked as your tunic sleeves, and probably still has better flavour than the cabbage. A mainstream fact: food at medieval weddings was as much about quantity as quality. Feasts were meant to display generosity and, if possible, excess. One noble wedding recorded serving 3,000 eggs, 400 rabbits, and an alarming number of eels. Your village wedding is more modest but no less enthusiastic. You eat until the belt you borrowed starts whispering mistake. Now for the toasts. They begin formally with your local elder raising a mug and intoning something about prosperity and fruitfulness. Then come the stories, embellished tales of how your families met, or how your uncle once caught a pig bare-handed, or how your new spouse supposedly milked a cow so efficiently the priest wept. Each toast includes the joke. Some are funny, some are very old. One involves a turnip and a nun, and absolutely no context. You laugh politely and drink. The ale is stronger than it looks, or maybe the bread is just soaking it up too slowly. A fringe tidbit: in some regions, wedding guests competed in subtle roasting of the couple. Not hostile, just witty jabs. May your roof be strong and your goats never judge your dancing. May your children be many and mostly resemble you. If you could laugh without offence, it meant your marriage would be strong. If not, well, someone might bring up the cabbage again. And then comes music. Not a band exactly, more like Cousin Wilfred and his 3-stringed lute, plus someone with a hollow log and rhythm. There's clapping. A few guests try to dance. Someone falls over. A child tries to feed stew to the goose, which is either a guest or the next course. No one is sure anymore. Dancing varies by region. In some places, you and your spouse must perform a slow, symbolic circle around the table. In others, guests try to bump into you without spilling ale. Either way, your knees creak and your new shoes pinch. But the smiles are genuine. The smell of meat and sweat ale and ash love and anxiety hangs thick in the room. This is celebration by firelight. Raw, awkward, deeply human. By the end of the feast, you're exhausted, your partner's garland is wilted, your cousin is asleep in the bread pile, and someone is retelling the story of how your great-aunt once mistook a sheep for a bishop. For the 7th time, you stand. The room quiets. You thank them awkwardly, sincerely. They cheer, it's loud, the goose honks, and just like that, the mood changes. From public to private, from feast to what comes next. It starts with a knock, not on a door but on a table. 3 sharp taps, a signal. The kind that silences a room, even if only for a beat. You and your spouse exchange a look, equal parts anticipation and mild dread. Because now, after the wine and the bread, after the cabbage and the toasts, it's time for the bedding. Yes, that bedding. And don't worry, this is the PG-13 version, awkward enough on its own, even without embellishment. The bedding ceremony is not about passion. It's about proof, legitimacy, symbolism, community, which in medieval terms means being undressed by relatives and put to bed under the gaze, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, of your entire social circle. It begins innocently enough. A handful of women take the bride by the arm, leading her away. They giggle, murmur blessings, maybe adjust her wreath. Meanwhile, a group of men pull the groom in the opposite direction, often with more noise and less tact. Clothing is removed. Not all of it. Not yet. Just layers. Tunics are unlaced, belts unbuckled. Shoes are pulled off with great ceremony. This is a public ritual after all. The idea isn't to embarrass, but also, sort of it is. You're escorted separately through the feast hall, each surrounded by a parade of chanting, chuckling supporters. Someone bangs a pot, someone else tosses petals, someone inevitably starts singing a ballad that seems far too personal to be coincidental. You're both deposited in the same room or corner or loft or bed made of straw behind a curtain. Privacy is not the point. The point is community acknowledgement. That everyone saw you go in, that everyone agrees this is official. A mainstream fact here, the bedding ceremony was legal proof of consummation. In many regions, especially under canon law, a marriage wasn't truly valid until it was completed. And since physical privacy wasn't always assumed, some sort of witnessed or publicly confirmed ritual became the norm. But fear not, most guests leave before things get too personal. Some might stay just long enough to hear the bed creak or claim they did. One German custom involved tying noisy bells to the bed frame so that any motion was met with celebratory clanging. A very medieval version of leave, no doubt. Sometimes there was wine brought to the bedside, sometimes prayers, sometimes inexplicably a rooster. It depended on the region, the budget, and how many relatives were feeling mischievous. Historians still debate whether bedding ceremonies were truly observed by watching, or if most of it was theatrical. Likely it was a mix. The witnesses stayed for the start, then left with knowing winks and 2 loud farewells. What happened afterward was up to you, and probably still interrupted by at least one distant uncle snoring against the fire pit. There's a fringe tradition from the Pyrenees where newlyweds were presented with a bowl of milk and a slice of bread in bed. If the bread floated, it meant harmony. If it sank well, hopefully one of you could swim. It's a cute superstition, unless your bread sinks, and someone writes a ballad about it. You and your spouse, alone at last, now face the strangest quiet of the entire day. All that noise, all those rituals, and suddenly, stillness. Maybe you whisper something kind, maybe you laugh. Maybe you both stare at the thatched ceiling and wonder if geese snore. There's a soft blanket, probably scratchy. The bed is narrow. The mattress is lumpy, but there's warmth. From bodies, from proximity, from the sheer shared absurdity of the past several hours. You don't have to love each other yet. That might come, or not. In many medieval marriages, love was a slow brewing stew, not a lightning strike. What matters is the bond, the vow, the recognition by the community, by the church, by the goose. You drift towards sleep. Not easily. The fire crackles nearby. The scent of rosemary lingers. Outside, someone plays a last note on a pipe. A dog barks. A cousin stumbles past the door mumbling something about soup. And in the softest moment when the laughter has faded and the straw stops rustling, you feel it, the gentle weight of presence. Of someone beside you, equally bewildered, equally exhausted, equally committed to whatever comes next. No fanfare, no strings, just two people in a bed too small for the enormity of the day. And somewhere nearby, a goose that has finally mercifully fallen silent. Morning arrives not with a sunrise, but with a rooster that takes its job very seriously. Its crow cuts through your dreams, like a dagger made of farm chores. You and your spouse open your eyes separately cautiously and exchange the kind of glance that says, well, that happened. There's no pillow talk in the traditional sense, just a stiff neck, a cramp in your leg, and the faint smell of last night's onions. You rise, stretch, step carefully so as not to wake your cousin, who apparently decided your wedding room was the ideal spot to finish his ale-induced nap. The bedding ceremony is over. The feast is done. But what if things don't stay blissful? Welcome to the surprisingly complicated world of medieval unmarriage. Because while getting married might involve cabbage geese and public hand-holding, getting out of a marriage was a whole different kettle of trout. First, the basics, divorce. As we think of it today, was nearly impossible. The church considered marriage a sacrament, something eternal. You couldn't just opt out because your spouse snored or didn't respect your prized turnip garden. Instead, there was annulment. That meant declaring that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. There were ways. You could claim one of you was underage, or already secretly married, or too closely related, and let's be honest, in some villages, that one came up a lot, or you guessed it, failure to consummate. A mainstream fact court actually investigated these claims. Witnesses were called, bedsheets examined, neighbours asked if they heard suspiciously quiet evenings. It was part drama, part farce, and entirely invasive. One famous case involved a noblewoman who claimed her husband was completely incapable of fulfilling marital duties. The court ordered a public demonstration of attempted affection with clerics present. He failed. She was freed. The clerics required years of counselling, probably. For regular folk, things were less formal. If you really couldn't stand each other and had no legal grounds for annulment, you had a few options, none of them great. There was separation from bed and board. It meant you could live apart but not remarry, ever. You remained spiritually wed, just not practically. Like having a roommate you're legally forbidden to ignore. Another option, vanishing. If one spouse disappeared, say, left for a pilgrimage and never came back, the other might be able to remarry after a number of years. Depending on the local laws, this ranged from 3 to 7, or until someone found a skeleton in the woods and said, oh, look, it's Gerald. Fringe tidbit time. In parts of Scandinavia, if a spouse was abusive or dangerous, a community could symbolically kill the marriage. The partner would be declared socially dead and their name erased from records. It wasn't legally recognised everywhere, but it was emotionally effective. Sometimes people simply pretended the marriage had never happened. New villages, new names, new lives. It was risky, especially if a jealous ex showed up mid-market day waving the old wedding spoon. But perhaps the most peculiar strategy, marital combat. Yes, real sanctioned trial by combat for married couples. In certain regions of medieval Germany, a wife and husband could legally fight to resolve disputes. She got a sack of stones. He got one hand tied behind his back. It sounds absurd, and it was, but records show these battles did happen, with sometimes tragic, sometimes surprisingly cathartic outcomes. Historians still argue whether these duels were symbolic or literal. Some accounts read like theatrical rituals. Others end in injury or worse. Either way, it was one medieval method of saying, "We're done here." Of course, most couples simply endured. There were no therapists, no podcasts, just shared chores, shared silence, and perhaps over time a kind of weathered companionship. Some even grew to like each other. Familiarity breeds, something close to affection if not love. But if all else failed, if the cabbage didn't bring fertility, the goose gave bad omens and the bread kept sinking, you could always retreat to the church or to relatives or to your own muddy little corner of the world. You might be stuck with your spouse, but you weren't stuck without dignity. Life was short, people died often, and second marriages were more common than you'd think. So you fold your bedding, sip your thin ale, avoid your spouse's gaze until the second cup kicks in. It's quiet, a little tense, but also survivable. Because sometimes in the medieval world, staying married wasn't about passion or poetry. It was about patience, mutual toleration, and knowing when to let the goose sleep between you, just to avoid another argument. The years pass, some slowly, like honey in winter, others quickly, like spilled ale on a feast day. Your marriage, awkward, cabbage-blessed, and goose-interrupted, settles into a rhythm. You wake, you work, you nod at each other, across the field or fire pit. You speak more now. You laugh sometimes. You argue softly. And then inevitably one of you is alone again. Maybe it's an illness. Maybe a farm accident. Maybe they just didn't come back from market and no one could find the mule, the cart, or the sack of turnips. Medieval life is fickle that way. The community gathers, murmurs, prayers, lights candles, and suddenly you are no longer married, you are widowed. This, oddly enough, brings options. A mainstream fact here, medieval society viewed widowhood as both loss and liberty. You grieve, yes, but you also gain autonomy, especially if you're a woman. As a widow, you can own property, run a household, make decisions without permission. It's not freedom exactly, but it's more than many married women had. Of course, the pressure to remarry begins almost immediately. Neighbours nudge, priests hint, cousins whisper things like, "You know who's also lonely, old Tomlin, still has both ears and a cow." The suggestion hovers, then lands. But remarriage isn't automatic. You consider it. Do you want another round of cabbage leaves and barley wine? Another ceremony with public hand-holding and symbolic bedding? You remember the goose. You're still not sure what it meant. And sometimes, just sometimes, your second marriage is with someone you actually chose. You meet them by chance, at the mill, at a funeral, yes it happens, at a feast where they compliment your bread and mean it. They don't know your first wedding was officiated by a priest who forgot your name twice. They just smile, and suddenly the thought of geese doesn't feel so heavy. But remarriage could be complicated. Legal hurdles remained. You needed proof that you were free to marry again. Witnesses, documents. In some regions, if you remarried too quickly, people would mutter. "Hardly cold in the ground," they'd say, as if grief had a timer. Ah yes, remarriage in the medieval household. Romantic, yes, but only if you find diplomacy romantic. Because once the vows are spoken, the real challenge begins merging two households. Which in your case means two sets of children, two opinions about soup seasoning, and one suspiciously territorial goat. Let's talk inheritance. If you have children from your first marriage, and statistically you probably do, the big question becomes, who gets what? Your son thinks he's inheriting the butter churn. Your new spouse thinks their daughter deserves it because she actually uses it and doesn't wander off mid-churn to chase ducks. You think maybe it's not worth fighting over until someone brings it up over dinner and the stew goes cold from tension. Property laws don't help much. They vary from village to village and are enforced with all the consistency of a wet scroll. In some areas, widowed women keep everything. In others, the in-laws arrive like tax collectors and claim the sheep, the linens, and that nice iron kettle your cousin smuggled in from Bruges. You can try to contest it, but you'll need 3 witnesses, a sympathetic priest, and probably a gift basket. And if your new spouse brings children of their own, well, now it's a full-fledged household alliance. Your family meals feel less like supper and more like high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. The youngest child wants a second dumpling. Someone else wants a different spot at the fire. And suddenly you're mediating a heated argument over who gets the bed corner closest to the dog. Medieval remarried homes weren't fairy tales. They were coalitions. carefully balanced, always in flux, and prone to collapsing over burnt porridge, or a misplaced wooden spoon. Spoon rights were real. One widow reportedly kept hers in a locked box. Another painted her initials on the handle. You do what you must. It's not that people didn't love again. Many did, but they loved within context, within limits, with the knowledge that this person might not be your one and only. They're your I survived my last spouse's gout and still believe in second chances partner. It's less lightning bolt, more warm stew on a rainy day. And that's okay. You share chores, you share bread, you share grief sometimes. You learn to recognize the sigh that means I miss them, and the one that means I wish you'd stop using that side of the bench. Over time, you may even share laughter again. Quiet at first, then louder, then real. But love in this world is never just about two people. It's about entanglements, legal, spiritual, social. It's about knowing that marrying again doesn't reset the board. It simply repositions the pieces. And just when you think you've heard it all, someone tells you about marrying the dead. Yes, really, it sounds like folklore, a bard's exaggeration, but it happened, not often, but often enough to make the church scribble furiously and the lawyers squint into the distance with headaches. The practice was called marriage à la façon du deuil, literally marriage in mourning. It took root mostly in parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, though rumours of similar customs drift across borders like gossip on the wind. The premise is this: a couple is betrothed, promises made, feast preparations underway, and then tragedy. One dies often, suddenly, always inconveniently. The surviving partner is left with grief, yes, but also a problem: no legal standing, no inheritance, no claim to property, children, or even the family goat. Enter the posthumous wedding. The living partner dresses in black, stands beside an empty chair or coffin, and says their vows. Sometimes a priest presides, sometimes a civil official, sometimes just witnesses. The dead do not reply, of course, but legally and emotionally, the marriage is sealed. It sounds eerie, and it was, but also practical. Because for all the strangeness, the ritual accomplished real things. It granted inheritance, protected children, preserved family arrangements. Sometimes it was the only way to keep everything from unravelling into chaos, or worse, falling into the hands of that one cousin who always wanted your duck pen. But beyond the logistics, these posthumous marriages offered closure, a sense that even in death, the promises mattered, that grief didn't get to steal everything, that the chair beside you wasn't just empty, it was honoured. And as strange as it seems to modern ears, there's something quietly powerful about saying I do to someone who cannot answer, but who once would have. A single figure at the altar, dressed in mourning black hands, trembling as they recite vows to a silent chair. No fanfare, no music, just whispered promises to someone who no longer breathes, but whose presence still fills the room like incense. Historians still argue over how widespread these posthumous marriages were. Some claim they were symbolic spiritual gestures with little legal weight. Others point to royal decrees and notarial records, suggesting that at least in certain corners of Europe, they were officially recognised. Like many things in the medieval world, it depends on the village, the priest, and whether anyone had a quill handy that day. And yes, sometimes the church protested. Marriage, after all, was meant to be a contract between two living souls. But in practice, when someone important wanted to marry their dearly departed, objections tended to get quieter, especially if the estate included a vineyard, a title, or several very convincing witnesses. These ceremonies were never casual. There were no drunken vows beside a tavern hearth. They were sombre affairs, equal parts love story and legal loophole. And for those left behind, they provided something that grief rarely offers: structure. A ritual, a script, a way to mark the end, not just with sorrow, but with ceremony. In a world where death was common but closure was rare, this mattered. Because medieval love wasn't neat. It didn't follow clean arcs or tidy endings. It was layered, unpredictable, shaped as much by inheritance and obligation as by desire. You could find yourself deeply attached to someone and still negotiating who got the cider press in the event of plague. And yet even with all that mess, people kept trying. They found ways to love again, to protect their children, to honour the past while shaping the future. Whether through remarriage, symbolic vows, or standing beside a ghost in front of a priest who definitely wasn't trained for this sort of thing. And that's the heart of it. Rituals endured, even when they were bizarre, even when they made little practical sense, because rituals gave shape to the chaos. Whether your spouse was beside you in bed across the dinner table or only in memory, the gesture still meant something. Back in your cottage, years older, now you find yourself standing by the window. The storm has rolled in, wind rattling the shutters, rain ticking against the thatch like impatient fingers. You hold your chipped wedding cup, the one from that ridiculous muddy cabbage-scented day so long ago. It's warm in your hands, familiar. The hearth glows, shadows dance across the wall, and in that flickering light, you remember things you thought you'd forgotten: the weight of a ribbon tied around your wrist, the sound of barley wine being poured, the expression on their face when the goose flapped across the ceremony mid-vow. You remember love, not just the high notes, but the daily hum of it, the comfort, the shared burdens, the way someone's breath beside you in a cold room can feel like hope. You've remarried, you've lost, you've held too much in silence and laughed too loudly when no one expected it. You've walked beside the living and once almost beside the dead, and through it all you carried the rituals with you like a worn prayer, half mumbled, half believed. Because in the end, love in the medieval world was not about perfection, it was about persistence, a daily choosing, a reaching across time, loss and mud, a willingness to whisper vows into silence and still mean every word. You sip from your old cup. It's slightly bitter now, but you smile, because it's real, and it mattered. And you remember the goose, the cabbage, the look your spouse gave you as someone tied rosemary to your wrist, the way the ale tasted, the laughter, the silence, the beginning of everything. Because weddings weren't just about joy, they were anchors, milestones, markers in the muddy timeline of life. Proof that even in a world of plague, war and spoiled turnips, people still chose each other, even if only for a time. And so as you lean back, candlelight dancing in your cup, you allow yourself a small crooked smile, because it happened, and it mattered. Now the embers glow low, the feast has long since ended, the guests have gone home stumbling down starlit paths, bellies full, voices hoarse from songs and too many toasts. The hall is quiet now, just the crackle of the last log and the faint, steady breathing of someone asleep in the corner. You're alone, or perhaps not alone. Not quite. You still feel the warmth of the ceremony, of hands briefly held, of firelight on worn faces, of laughter shared over soup too thin and bread too hard. You feel the shape of a life gently folded around all its awkward beginnings. Outside, the wind stirs, a shutter knocks softly. Somewhere far off, a dog barks and is answered. You nestle deeper into your blanket, your thoughts still wandering among linen tunics, whispered vows, half-sung ballads, and a goose that for one unforgettable day ruled the room. Whatever your own life looks like, married, single, once, or never, the strange rituals of those who came before offer something reassuring. That people have always hoped, always tried, always found meaning in the joining of lives, no matter how humble or hilariously unpredictable the joining may be. And now, with your body heavy, your mind quieting, and the past softly stitched into your breath, it's time to rest. Let the story settle into your chest like a warm ember. Let the goose sleep too. And may your dreams be as strange and tender as a medieval wedding night.